Back in February of 2008, I decided that I needed a change in my monotonous life. Whether that change would come in the form of a new job or a new toothbrush, I didn't know. I was never the most adventurous person, and the limit of my existence usually depended on which book I was reading at the time. It took me a while to realize that my happiness often derived from the stories that my mind was living in. I was an avid bookworm, a miserable synecdoche as that is. Once I realized my true outlet, I immediately knew what I wanted. I purchased a small shop, quit my boring job, renovated the building, and transformed it into a bookstore. I had never been happier. The next 2 years were the best of my life. The store had a huge hit with the locals. My perspective on work had been completely altered, and I was feeling genuinely happy for the first time since my childhood. It was during the winter of 2010 that she walked into my store. She stepped inside out of the snow and approached me with a large bin bag. Etchings of age covered her pale face and hands. She must have been at least 80 years old. Slamming the bag on the counter, she simply said, "These are for you." I looked inside of the bag to find a selection of some of the greatest novels ever written. "Why? Do you want money for these, or some kind of book trade?" I asked confusingly. "No, they're yours to have. Take them." She gave me a feeling of uneasiness. Her dirty gray fringe slightly concealed her face as a cold gaze met my vision. Are you sure you want me to have them? Wouldn't you rather sell them?" "No, I have no use for them, nor for money." "Okay. Thank you. What's your name?" "Lucy." She muttered her final words and left my store. I found it all too strange that somebody would give away such great books for nothing. But I suppose that some people are just nice like that. I made my way home that night and took the books with me so that I could go through them. I piled them up on the table and was surprised to see that all of them were in fantastic condition. A couple of them seemed to be first editions, and others were versions that I had never even seen before. It took me a moment to realize, but the novels that I was looking at were not as I had remembered them to be. The first book that I picked up was The Green Mile. On the front cover, there was an image of John Coffey smiling and holding two dead, naked girls. I opened it up and flicked through the pages. In this version of the novel, he was in fact guilty of the rape and murder of both children. I made my way to the end of the book and read through the execution scene. All the officers who had grown to love John Coffey in the original novel were now laughing uncontrollably and screaming racial taunts as he was being executed. My eyes had seen enough. My stomach had felt enough too. The next book I picked up was Catcher in the Rye. The artwork on the front page seemed to be a dead body splattered on the street, drawn from an aerial view. I flicked through the book until I reached chapter 14, after Holden Caulfield speaks of messing with the idea of suicide. He suddenly breaks down in tears and jumps from the window, cracking his skull on the pavement below. The book abruptly ended after that. I then picked up Lord of the Flies. The defining image on this novel was of a large child with the face of a pig. He was covered in blood and surrounded by decaying corpses. After grazing through the pages, I reached a point in the story in which Piggy is described as being non-human, vicious, and a hungry animal. A chapter or so later, Jack insults Piggy, which leads him to losing his temper and ripping him apart. Piggy then proceeds to kill and eat the rest of the children. The remainder of the book was the same line repeated over and over again. Piggy sat alone on the island, waiting for death. I read through the few books that were left in the pile, and they all had been changed in some sick way. The Great Gatsby, Wuthering Heights, To Kill a Mockingbird, Ulysses. Every one of them. Just as I had reached the bottom of the pile, I noticed that the final book was one I had never even heard of before. It was called Last of the Sparks. I found this slightly unnerving, as I immediately paired it with my name, Aaron Sparks. Still, it was just a book. The front cover was of 6 gravestones with words too small to be read, etched into the granite. I looked up to the top corner of the book, and noticed that there was a sell-by date on it. June 4th, 2013. I nervously opened it up to the beginning of the story. Chapter 1. Alice Sparks. My stomach dropped as I read my mother's name upon the page. I felt dizzy and confused. As I anxiously made my way through the chapter, it seemed to detail a regular day in the life of the character. Until I reached the last page. Alice was crossing over the road when the heel of her shoe broke, causing her to fall. She didn't get to her feet fast enough, and a speeding driver struck her, puncturing both of her lungs. I felt sick to my stomach. I put the book down and went straight to bed, hoping for some sleep. I lay awake all night, as countless questions ran through my mind. The only thought that managed to put me to sleep was, it's just a book. The next morning when I got to work, I was feeling worse for wear. It wasn't until around lunchtime I began to perk up and regain a bit of my energy. Then the phone rang. I answered the call to my father crying on the other end. I immediately knew what happened. I closed the shop and ran to the hospital. But it was already too late. She was gone. Hit by a speeding driver, they said. I spent the next couple of weeks helping take care of my dad. Me, my brother, and my sister stayed with him in turns, looking after him. It wasn't until a few months later that I picked up Last of the Sparks. It just scared me so much the last time. I opened it up to page 37, and there it was. Chapter 2. Patrick Sparks. This story was more of the same, a day in the life. Right up to the part in which he shot himself in the kitchen whilst on the phone with his son. I ran to the phone to speak with him, comfort him, but then I realized what I may be doing. The phone picked up at the other end, and before I could say a word, he was gone. I got my black suit and tie out once more and repeated the same process for another parent. It ruined us all. After the funeral, I refused to touch the book. What if I had been causing these deaths by reading it? I couldn't go through with it again. But on Christmas Eve of 2011, I got a phone call from my brother's wife, Heather. Will had been putting up Christmas lights on the roof when he slipped on the ice and broke his neck. He died almost instantly. I threw the phone at the wall and began to sob into my sleeve. Anger took the pain away for a moment as I picked up the book and read through chapter 3. And it was exactly as Heather described. I fell asleep and woke up the next day with the book still on my lap. I decided to check who was going to go next out of me and my sisters, and hopefully warn them, or myself, in some way. I turned to the page. Chapter 4. Mary and Sarah Sparks. I rushed through the story as fast as I could until I reached the end. Both my brothers and their partners would drown in a lake after colliding with another car on a one-way bridge. That same sickly feeling took over me. I met with my sisters later that day to exchange gifts, and I told them as calmly as I could muster to be careful when driving. I had to sound as sane as possible, mentioning the lake, the bridge, and the fact that all four of them would be in a car at the same time. But at least I told them. Mary and Sarah drowned 8 months later. After I went to the funeral, I picked up the book and turned to the final pages. Chapter 5. Aaron Sparks. But I didn't read it. I'd rather not live in fear for so long. I decided to save it for a nearer time. After all, there was a sell-by date on it for a reason. Everything has been normal for the past 5 months or so. I questioned myself every day as to why she was doing this to me. But it didn't matter. It was all going to be over soon. I've just finished reading the final chapter. It's June 4th, 2013, and I'm sitting in my basement, waiting for her to arrive. That's the way the ending goes. Or so I've read.